Victoria Ashford woke at 5:47 a.m., 4 minutes before her alarm. Like she always did, there was no sleeping in anymore. Her body had learned decades ago that rest was a luxury for people who felt at peace. She didn't feel at peace. The penthouse stretched across 42 floors of the Ashford Capitol building, but it felt smaller every morning. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city still draped in darkness, millions of people sleeping. While she sat alone with a glass of Macallan 25 and a financial document that made her want to scream. The Riverside rezoning proposal, again. She'd already refused it twice. Richard had resubmitted it 3 times, each version slightly more aggressive. Each version slightly more certain that this time she wouldn't have the backbone to say no. The profit margins were obscene. The human cost was methodically documented in the section she kept skipping over. 2017 families would lose their homes within 18 months. Not through natural attrition, not through gentle market forces, through deliberate displacement, orchestrated so cleanly on paper that no one had to feel the weight of it. Her late husband Thomas had rejected this deal 5 years before he died. She still had his handwritten note in her personal safe, the one he'd left on the proposal she wasn't supposed to see. She pulled it out now. Read it again. His handwriting was steady, certain. "This is not what we built this for." She poured another finger of whiskey. It was 5:58 a.m. Her phone lit up with 43 unread messages. Board members, investors, Richard, all asking for a decision, all certain she'd eventually fold, because that's what she always did. She signed the expansion proposals, she approved the profit-maximizing strategies, she attended the galas and smiled, while her husband's vision for ethical development dissolved into something he wouldn't have recognized. She dressed in her armor. Armani suit, diamond earrings, hair pulled back so tightly it created a permanent expression of control. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone efficient, someone powerful, someone completely hollow. At the breakfast meeting with the board's investment committee, she smiled. She nodded. She said she was still reviewing the Riverside proposal. They left convinced she was weakening. But what Victoria Ashford didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that in exactly 6 hours her life would be interrupted by a man in a worn jacket, a man holding something that would force her to remember why any of this had ever mattered. DeShawn Hayes calculated the math the way he always did. Groceries first, then the power bill, then hope there was enough left for gas. He'd perfected this calculation years ago, back when Keisha left. Back when he realized he was going to do this alone. The grocery store checkout line moved slowly. Zara tugged at his sleeve. She was pointing at the candy display with the particular intensity of an 8-year-old who'd learned not to ask twice. He smiled down at her, shook his head gently. She didn't protest. She was good like that, too good for a kid her age. She'd learned to read his silences, his rationing. She understood consequences because he'd never shielded her from the basic arithmetic of survival. "Daddy, will my shoes last until winter?" she asked as they walked toward the exit. He looked down at her feet. The left shoe had duct tape along the seam. He'd fixed it 3 times. In the past 2 months, the sole had a tear. He'd covered it with the patch. That was already peeling. He'd tried to stretch the budget to buy her new ones last paycheck. But the alternator in his car had finally died, and priorities had shifted again. "We'll make it work," he said, which was what he always said. The rain hit them before they reached the parking lot, hard. The kind of rain that came from nowhere. That didn't care if you had a jacket that fit, or if your child was shivering. DeShawn removed his own jacket, the same one from 8 years ago, inherited from his own father. He wrapped it around Zara's shoulders. It swallowed her whole. The sleeves extended past her hands. "You're cold now," she said. "I'm fine," he replied. It was true. His body had learned to accept the cold, the way it had learned to accept everything else. Deprivation was just another negotiation with the world. They hurried toward the car. Somewhere in his mind he was calculating again. Rent was due in 8 days. The electric bill was overdue by 3 days. He had approximately $47 in his checking account. Until payday, which was 5 days away. Keisha never sent the child support anymore. Her new husband had hired a lawyer. That lawyer made the original agreement disappear into a system DeShawn couldn't afford to fight. The job had been stable for 7 years. Maintenance supervisor for the city's electrical infrastructure, decent benefits, health insurance that covered Zara. But stable wasn't the same as enough. And it certainly wasn't the same as progress. He'd applied to the advanced engineering program years ago, the one that could have moved him into design, into building instead of fixing. But that would have required evening classes, and there was no one to pick Zara up from school on those days. He'd withdrawn the application the week before the deadline. That was 6 years ago. He hadn't reapplied. As they walked, Zara did what she did most evenings. She tried to make him laugh. She made up stories about the raindrops racing each other, gave them names and personalities and romantic conflicts, despite everything, despite the wait. He smiled. She was remarkable in the way that children could be remarkable, while living in the margins of a world that had decided they didn't matter much. They reached the car. It was nothing special, 12 years old. Dents along the left side. A check engine light that had been on for so long it barely registered as a warning anymore. But it was his. Paid off 3 years ago, and that counted for something. As he loaded the groceries into the back seat, he found himself thinking about the choices that led here. He thought about his father, who'd worked 2 jobs, and still hadn't been enough to build anything. He thought about Keisha leaving, and how he'd tried to explain to Zara that sometimes people needed to save themselves, even if it meant leaving their daughter in the process. He didn't blame her, but he also couldn't afford to wait for her to change her mind. Tonight, Zara would sleep in the warm clothes she kept by her bed. They'd eat rice and beans, and maybe an egg if he could stretch the budget. Tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all again. He didn't know that tomorrow would look completely different. Victoria stepped out of the upscale restaurant at 6:45 p.m. The evening light was fading into that brief window of dusk. That always made her melancholy. The rain had started without warning, the way it often did in the city. Sudden, indifferent to whether anyone was prepared for it. She didn't notice the leather wallet slip from her bag. She didn't see it hit the wet pavement. Her driver was holding the car door open. She was already thinking about the conference call scheduled for 8 p.m., about the email she needed to send Richard, about the question of whether she had the strength to keep saying no to something that everyone else said was inevitable. The wallet lay in a puddle, slowly absorbing water. DeShawn and Zara emerged from the grocery store at 6:58 p.m. The parking lot was nearly empty. The rain was so heavy now that visibility had collapsed into a narrow sphere around their bodies. He held Zara's hand tightly, not because he was afraid she'd run. She wouldn't. But because contact was the only way he knew how to say, "I'm still here. I'm still fighting for you." He saw the wallet before he registered what it was. A black leather rectangle, in a puddle, expensive looking, even soaked. He paused. For a moment he didn't move. The practical calculation started immediately. "Don't touch it, not your problem, keep walking." But Zara had seen it too. She looked up at him with her eyes full of a question that had no good answer. He picked it up. The leather was soft. The kind of soft that comes from money and care and a world that took preservation seriously. Water dripped from his fingers as he opened it slightly. just enough to see identification. Victoria Ashford, CEO, Ashford Capital Holdings. His heart did something complicated. He'd seen her name in the news. Everyone had. She was the kind of woman whose life happened in public, whose decisions moved markets and shaped the city's future. She was the opposite of everything he was. Inside the wallet, a stack of cash. He didn't count it, but his mind did the counting anyway. Hundreds, definitely. Maybe more than 1,000. His fingers tightened around the leather. Zara didn't ask if they were keeping it. She just watched his face, reading the storm happening behind his eyes. There was his daughter's shoes. There was the heater that had been broken for 3 weeks. There was the creeping dread that one bad week would collapse everything he'd built. There was the voice, his own voice, the one that sounded like his father. Like every relative who'd ever bent themselves into pretzels trying to survive. Whispering that no one would know, that no one would blame him. 4 seconds passed. It felt like a lifetime. DeShawn closed the wallet. No, he said quietly, though Zara hadn't asked. He looked toward the parking lot entrance. A luxury car was pulling away, its taillights fading into the rain. Security guards were loading into another vehicle. That must be her. That must be the woman who carried around enough cash to solve his problems and never notice it was gone. He could have let it go. He could have told himself that she'd just cancel the cards and replace the cash. That people like her lost money the way he lost pennies. But Zara was watching. He ran. His worn shoes splashed through puddles. His old jacket flapped against his sides. He called out to the woman in the sharp suit, just as her driver was closing the car door. Victoria heard something in the rain. A voice. The kind that didn't belong in this section of the parking lot. The kind that made her security detail tense. She turned. A black man was approaching, breathless, holding something up. Her wallet. Her first instinct was to signal her security. But something in his face stopped her. He wasn't reaching for her. He wasn't angry or demanding. He was just offering. He slowed down a respectable distance away, not the approach of someone trying to rob her. He held the wallet at arm's length. "Your wallet," he said, rain streaming down his face. Victoria took it. She opened it immediately, a habit of caution, of never trusting, and checked inside. Everything was there. The cash, the cards, everything. She looked at him properly then. His jacket barely protected him. His shoes were worn through. And there was a child beside him, a small girl, who had one arm wrapped around his waist, both of them soaked. "You didn't take anything," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. She was stating a fact she couldn't quite believe. DeShawn shook his head. Didn't seem right. There was something in his voice that made her stop. Not the obsequiousness of someone asking for a reward. Not the resentment of someone who wanted credit for basic human decency. Just a quiet certainty, the kind that came from living according to principles, even when principles cost you. Victoria looked at Zara. The girl was staring at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. It was the look of someone seeing you clearly, seeing past the suit and the authority, seeing the person underneath, who'd been lost for so long she'd almost forgotten what being found felt like. "Thank you," Victoria said softly. And she meant it. DeShawn nodded. He turned to go, pulling Zara gently back toward the parking lot. Victoria watched them leave, the man and the child, both disappearing into the rain. Her security detail asked if she wanted them to follow, to verify the wallet, to make sure there was no fraud. She said no. She sat in the car without telling her driver to move. She opened the wallet again. She looked at the identification inside, at her own face preserved in laminate, and realized she couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something for her, without wanting something in return. By the time she reached the penthouse, she'd made a decision that surprised even herself. She picked up the phone. 11:47 p.m. I need you to find someone for me, she told her assistant. A black male, early 40s, with a young daughter. They were at the north parking lot on 5th Avenue at approximately 7 p.m. He returned my wallet. I need everything you can find. DeShawn didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about her face, about the way she'd looked at Zara, about the certainty in her voice when she said he didn't take anything. It wasn't gratitude he'd expected, it was just acknowledgement that he wasn't a monster. That context existed for people like him. By morning, he'd mostly forgotten about it. Bills didn't stop. Work didn't pause. Zara needed lunch money for school. He was outside his small rental house the next morning, Friday, fixing Zara's bicycle. The chain had slipped again, the gears worn from years of riding. He knelt on the ground with his tools spread around him. Zara sitting on the porch steps, eating cereal. Both of them moving through the morning ritual of a life that had learned to make do with less. That was when he heard the engines. Multiple engines. The kind of sound that didn't belong on a block where most people drove sedans from the 2000s and trusted their vehicles would start most of the time. DeShawn looked up. 3 black luxury cars were moving slowly down the street. Not aggressively, not searchingly, just arriving with intention. Mrs. Chen from across the street stepped onto her porch. The Johnson kids paused their game. Someone pulled out a phone. DeShawn felt his stomach tighten. The first car stopped in front of his house. The doors opened. Victoria Ashford stepped out. She wasn't wearing casual clothes. She was in an elegant suit. Her hair perfectly styled, her presence somehow making his entire street feel smaller. She moved with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never had to negotiate whether she belonged anywhere. She simply walked, the way someone walked through a building they owned. DeShawn stood slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. Zara came to stand behind him, her small hand gripping his sleeve. Victoria approached without hesitation, without the awkwardness people sometimes carried when they entered neighborhoods like his. She simply walked. She looked at the house, the peeling paint, the broken gutter, Zara's chalk drawings on the driveway, pictures of families and homes and things she imagined instead of what she had. For just a moment, something flickered across Victoria's face. Not pity, not judgment, something older, something like recognition. Like she was seeing something she'd worked very hard not to remember existed. Ms. Ashford, DeShawn said. It wasn't a question. He knew who she was. You're at my house, he continued. His voice steady, not confused, not automatically grateful, just stating fact. Because you disappeared, Victoria replied. Her voice was calm. But there was something underneath it. Surprise, maybe, that he hadn't called, that he hadn't tried to leverage the moment into something. I don't understand, DeShawn said. And he didn't. This didn't make sense. Powerful people didn't come to poor neighborhoods. They didn't stand in front of cameras and neighbors. They didn't care about the people in the margins. Victoria held out an envelope. Her hand was steady, but he noticed her fingers trembled slightly. As she extended it, "Open it," she said. DeShawn hesitated. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that something this large didn't happen to people like him. But Zara was watching. So was everyone else on the street. He opened the envelope. Inside was a job offer. Senior Operations Manager, Ashford Capital Holdings. The salary listed made his breath stop. It was more than 3 times what he made now. There were benefits listed. Health insurance, dental, vision, a college fund for his child, 401k matching. He read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something. I watched you yesterday, Victoria said quietly. You had every reason to keep that money. $3,200. More than most people see in a month. But you came back. DeShawn couldn't speak. I'm surrounded by people who would compromise anything for approval, Victoria continued. I sit in rooms with people who destroy their entire foundation for just a little more profit, and you just met me, and you returned my wallet. DeShawn finally looked up at her. Why would you offer this? You don't know me. I know enough, Victoria said. And something in her voice told him she meant it, with a depth that went beyond logic. I need someone I can trust, actually trust, not someone performing honesty, someone who actually has it. I don't have a degree, DeShawn said. Not in business. I've been maintenance. You have something more valuable, Victoria interrupted. Character, integrity. Skills can be taught, character cannot. Zara squeezed his hand. She wasn't speaking. But he felt her understanding. This was important. This was the moment. DeShawn looked down at the offer letter. He thought about the heater that didn't work. He thought about the shoes with the hole in the sole. He thought about every time he told Zara they'd figure it out. Because that's what you told your child when you didn't have another option. When would I start? He asked. Monday, Victoria said. 8 a.m. Don't be late. There was no warmth in her voice. No congratulations, just a statement of expectation. Like she'd already decided he would accept, and was simply waiting for him to catch up. I need to know something, DeShawn said, his voice careful. What is this really about? Victoria met his eyes directly, and for just a moment he saw past the suit and the control. He saw someone who looked as lost as he felt. It's about reminding myself why I started building this in the first place, she said quietly. Then she turned and walked back to her cars. Security detail following. The entire street watching in stunned silence. Zara tugged his sleeve. Dad DeShawn looked at the offer letter still in his hands. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his neighborhood. At Mrs. Chen on her porch trying to figure out what had just happened. At the bikes and the small houses and the life he'd built for the two of them. Everything's about to change, he whispered. He had no idea how right he was. Victoria didn't go directly to the office that day. Instead, she had her driver take her to her penthouse, where she poured whiskey at 2:30 in the afternoon, and tried to understand what had just compelled her to offer a man she'd met once, a senior position, managing millions of dollars of company assets. It didn't make sense. It violated every principle of corporate governance. It would face resistance from the board. It was irrational and emotional, and exactly the kind of decision that got removed from boardrooms. And yet she couldn't stop thinking about his face, the way he hadn't immediately accepted, the way he'd asked about the job's purpose instead of its salary, the way his daughter had stood beside him, with her hand on his sleeve, both of them waiting for him to decide what came next. At midnight, Victoria called her assistant. I need background, she said. The man from the parking lot, early 40s, black, was carrying a young daughter. Parked a sedan looked like it was from the early 2000s. Find him. Her assistant, accustomed to last-minute demands, went to work. By 3 a.m., they had a file. DeShawn Hayes, 39 years old, maintenance supervisor for the city's electrical infrastructure. Salary $38,000 annually. Divorced 3 years prior. Sole custodian of one child, Zara Hayes, age 8. No criminal record. Steady employment history. Perfect driving record. An application to an advanced engineering program 6 years ago. That he'd withdrawn from 1 week before the deadline. Victoria read the file repeatedly. She looked at his parking record. No violations. She looked at his employment reviews. Exceptional. She looked at his public records and found almost nothing, because he didn't have anything worth noting publicly. And yet he'd returned $3,200 in cash. She looked at a picture from the city's employee database. A black man with tired eyes and a face that had learned not to expect much. But there was something else there too. Something that had held on to integrity, even when integrity cost him things. Victoria pulled up her late husband's refusal letter. On the Riverside deal, she read it again. The handwriting familiar, the conviction absolute. This is not what we built this for. When had she stopped believing that? When had her own company become something she barely recognized? At 4:47 a.m., Victoria made a decision. She drafted an email to her HR department, outlining a new position. Senior Operations Manager, Ashford Capital Holdings. Salary $180,000. Benefits full package. Requirements none that couldn't be learned. She attached a note. This position exists to serve company culture and integrity. Offer to DeShawn Hayes. Provide him with startup resources and whatever support he needs. This is a priority hire. She hit send at 4:48 a.m. Then she finally slept. Her dreams filled with a man in the rain and a child's hand gripping a father's sleeve. And the question of whether redemption came when you started building differently, or when you finally admitted everything you'd built before was wrong. DeShawn spent Thursday night unable to sleep, reading the job offer again and again. He researched Victoria Ashford, found articles about her company, about the Riverside project that was in the news, for all the wrong reasons. Massive profit, massive human cost. Something about rezoning that didn't sit right with anyone paying attention. He also researched what happened to people who took jobs they weren't qualified for, who accepted opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Usually the ending involved them discovering they'd been set up to fail, or used, or both. But he had Zara to think about. He had a daughter who wore shoes with holes in them. He had a heater that didn't work, and a car that was dying. He called his supervisor and requested the day off Friday. Then he spent the morning washing his only decent shirt, pressing his one pair of slacks, trying to look like someone who belonged in the world Victoria Ashford inhabited. By 7:45 a.m. Monday, he was standing in front of the Ashford Capitol building, a structure of glass and steel. That made him feel profoundly small. Security knew his name before he said it. Someone was waiting to escort him. The 48th floor was glass and minimalism. Everything was expensive and carefully arranged. He was led to a desk, not an office, a desk positioned in the open floor. With Raymond, a white man in his 50s with a warm smile, assigned as his immediate supervisor. "Welcome to operations," Raymond said, shaking his hand. "Victoria has big plans for you." DeShawn wanted to ask what plans, what he was really doing here, why Victoria had appeared at his house, and changed his life without explanation. But he understood that asking too many questions too quickly made you look like you didn't belong. And he already felt like he didn't belong, in a way that made his skin visible in a different way. Throughout the day, he observed. He watched who had real power, and who performed power. He noticed who made decisions, and who pretended to make decisions. He saw the hierarchy that wasn't in any org chart, the unspoken structure of who was trusted, and who was tolerated. Raymond explained that his actual role was to review operations across all Ashford Capital developments. He would have access to files, to financial reports, to community impact assessments. He would essentially be watching what the company was doing. By late afternoon, Victoria called him to a private conference room on the 47th floor. She was different here, more controlled, more armored. But when she closed the door, something shifted. "You're here to see everything," she said without preamble. "The good developments and the bad ones. And specifically, I need you to understand what we're doing with Riverside." She pulled out a file. Inside was the original proposal from 5 years earlier, the one her husband had rejected. She pulled out the current version, the one Richard was pushing through the board. The Riverside neighborhood had 2,017 families. The original proposal would displace 87% of them. Through property acquisition and forced relocation, the profit margin was calculated to $280 million. My husband looked at this, Victoria said, her voice steady. But something underneath it shaking, and he said no. He said this wasn't what we built for. She looked at DeShawn directly. I'm asking you to help me understand if there's a way to do this differently. To develop the property, generate profit, and not destroy a community in the process. DeShawn understood then. This wasn't a job offer, this was a test. And the test was whether he could stay honest inside a system designed to make honesty expensive. Why are you telling me this? He asked, because Victoria said, I can't do it alone, and I don't trust anyone else in this building. Over the next week, DeShawn and Victoria met late every afternoon in the secure conference room. She showed him everything. The financial projections, the profit comparisons, the community impact studies that Richard had commissioned, and then buried because they showed exactly how catastrophic the displacement would be. She explained that Richard, her brother-in-law, had orchestrated her late husband's exclusion from day-to-day operations before he died, then moved forward with aggressive development strategy. Once she inherited control, she admitted she'd signed initial approvals without fully reading them. Distracted by grief, by trying to maintain the company's stability, by not wanting to rock the board. I was a coward, Victoria said. One night, reading through demographic data of who would lose their homes. I made ethical decisions until they cost me something, and then I stopped making them. DeShawn didn't comfort her. He let her feel the weight of it. What do you want to do? He asked finally. Victoria looked up from the files. I don't know if I'm strong enough to destroy my own company's profit. I don't know if the board will follow me. I don't know if this is even possible. Those are practical questions, DeShawn said. Not ethical ones. Exactly, Victoria replied. The ethical choice is clear. Everything else is just fear. They developed a plan. Compile evidence of Richard's financial interests in the displacement. Find alternative development proposals. That could generate sustainable profit without mass displacement. Present both options to the board and force them to choose between profit and integrity. But even as they worked, something else was shifting between them. Victoria would show DeShawn a proposal, and their hands would touch over the papers. She would explain a financial concept, and he would ask questions that made her see her own business differently. They would look at each other for a moment longer than necessary, before one of them found a reason to look away. By the end of the week, Richard noticed. He cornered DeShawn in the elevator. So you're Victoria's new diversity hire, he said, with a smile that wasn't friendly. How's that going for you? You keeping up with the complexity? DeShawn didn't respond with resentment. He stayed calm, which somehow made Richard more angry. You're going to figure out pretty quickly, Richard continued, that you don't belong here. And when this experiment fails, Victoria's going to need to salvage her credibility. You understand that, right? You're expendable. DeShawn pressed the button for his floor and said nothing. That night he told Victoria what Richard had said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, he's right about one thing. If this goes wrong, I'll need someone to blame. The board will demand it. They won't accept that I made a bad decision. They'll want a scapegoat. Are you telling me to leave? DeShawn asked. I'm telling you that helping me means accepting risk you shouldn't have to take. DeShawn thought about his daughter. He thought about the shoes with the hole in the sole. He thought about the mathematics of poverty and how even a good salary could disappear quickly if the wrong thing happened. I'm staying, he said. Victoria's relief was visible. The week of the board presentation arrived faster than DeShawn had anticipated. He and Victoria had worked 18-hour days, compiling evidence, building their alternative proposal, preparing for the resistance they knew would come. but they hadn't anticipated how real the danger was until Richard leaked information about the presentation to the board members who supported him. DeShawn found out at 7 a.m. on presentation day. Raymond called him into the office and closed the door. Richard's been messaging board members, Raymond said quietly. He's telling them Victoria's lost objectivity, that she's been influenced by a new hire without proper business background, that the alternative proposal is financially unsound. Is it, DeShawn asked. No, Raymond said. It's actually more stable long-term. Mixed income development creates community stability, which creates market stability. But that requires patience. Most board members want the quick profit. DeShawn called Victoria immediately. I know, she said before he could tell her. Richard warned me this morning. He said if I present the alternative, he'll recommend my immediate removal from the company. He has the votes. There was no fear in her voice, which somehow made it more frightening. Then we're done, DeShawn said. There's no point presenting if we're presenting anyway, Victoria interrupted. Because the alternative to fighting is losing. And if we lose 2,017 families lose their homes, you understand that, right? The only failure is the failure to try. At 9 a.m., Victoria stood in front of the board with DeShawn beside her. She presented the evidence methodically. She showed Richard's financial interests. The shell company he'd created specifically to profit from displacement. She showed the community impact studies he'd buried. The data showing that 87% of families would become homeless within 5 years. Under the current proposal, she showed the alternative, a mixed income development that would generate $180 million in profit instead of $280 million, but would preserve the community and create long-term economic stability. She said, my husband rejected this deal for a reason. I rejected it twice for a reason, and I'm asking you to reject it now. Not because it's the profitable choice, but because it's the choice that lets us sleep at night. The board was silent. Then Richard responded. He dismissed the alternative as naive. He said DeShawn had no business advising on development. He demanded an immediate vote on the original proposal. But the board chairman, a white man named David Chen, who'd known Victoria's husband, asked one question. Did you hide the impact studies, Richard? Richard's silence was answer enough. The vote took 7 minutes. The Riverside displacement proposal was rejected, 7-4. The alternative proposal was approved for further development. Richard's position became untenable by lunch. He resigned his board position by 3 p.m. DeShawn spent the weekend trying to process what had just happened. Richard Ashford, powerful, wealthy, connected, had essentially been forced out of his own company's board because of evidence DeShawn had helped compile. He researched what came next: investigations into Richard's financial irregularities, civil suits from families who'd been unfairly displaced by previous developments, securities fraud from his undisclosed interests in company projects. By Monday, Richard Ashford was no longer just a board member. He was a liability. Sunday evening, DeShawn and Zara sat in their small living room. She was reading to him a book she'd checked out from the library about a girl who wanted to be an engineer. He listened, but his mind was elsewhere. Dad, Zara said, putting down the book, "Are you different now?" He looked at his daughter. At 8 years old, she understood more than she should have to understand. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Of what? That I'm going to mess this up. That being brave is temporary, and I'm going to go back to being just scared." Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made him realize why she'd survived poverty without becoming cynical. Scary is just love trying to happen. He pulled her close, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe actually things could be different. DeShawn's role evolved rapidly over the next month. What had started as senior operations manager became something more nebulous. but infinitely more powerful. He was essentially Victoria's eyes and ears, reviewing operations across all developments, identifying issues before they became crises, and quietly ensuring that the company's direction aligned with its stated values. On his first official day in the position, he arrived at the new corner office that Raymond had cleared for him. Small, glass-walled, but private, overlooking the city below. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. A black maintenance worker now had more access and authority than people who'd been at Ashford Capital for 15 years. By mid-morning, the resentment had become visible. He overheard two board members talking in the hallway. Victoria's lost it. Hiring someone like that into operations, it's desperation. Who does he think he is? Another voice asked. He doesn't have an MBA. He doesn't have board experience. He has what, a high school diploma and years of fixing equipment. DeShawn kept walking. By afternoon, he was in the first of what would become daily meetings with Victoria. The conference room, their conference room now, had become a kind of headquarters for their quiet revolution. Maps of the company's properties covered one wall. Financial reports covered another. The Riverside project dominated the center table. How are you settling in? Victoria asked. People are not happy I'm here, he said. No, Victoria agreed. But that's because they sense something is changing. The board expects you to fail. The executives expect you to fail. Even some of the junior staff are placing bets on how long you'll last. And you, he asked. I expect you to change everything, Victoria said simply. But not in the way they think. Not by proving you can play their game. By forcing them to play a different game entirely. Over the next 2 months, DeShawn and Victoria became inseparable at work. They met early, stayed late, and developed a partnership that confused the organization. Because it violated the expected hierarchy, Victoria showed him everything. The contracts that required review, the development proposals that needed vetting, the community partnerships that had been neglected. In pursuit of profit, she gave him real power, the ability to reject proposals, to demand impact studies, to slow down decisions that felt ethically questionable, and he used it. The first time he rejected a proposal, Victoria felt her chest tighten. It was a development that would generate significant profit, that had board support, that would probably have been approved under the old system, but it would have displaced 340 families without relocation assistance. DeShawn presented his analysis. The profit margins assume significant community displacement. If we factor in relocation assistance, affordable housing integration, and community business development, the profit is still substantial, but the human cost is zero. The board pushed back. Victoria supported him. The proposal was modified. The community was preserved. The profit was reduced by 18%, but the sustainability was increased indefinitely. One board member asked, "Are we running a charity?" Victoria responded, "We're running a company. Just one that understands that communities have value beyond what we can extract from them." By month 3, they'd rejected or significantly modified 7 proposals. 5 other companies had either withdrawn from bidding or partnered with Ashford Capital instead of competing. The board's skepticism had transformed into cautious respect, except from the members who'd been profiting from the exploitative developments. But something else had changed too. The professional distance between DeShawn and Victoria had become threadbare. She would touch his shoulder during meetings to emphasize a point and leave her hand there longer than necessary. He would look at her during debates and see not just the CEO, but the woman he'd met in the rain, the one who'd carried loneliness so heavy. She'd had to give it a name. One evening, working alone in the conference room at 10 p.m., Victoria said, "I'm afraid of this," of what DeShawn asked. "Of what happens if you get hurt?" "Because you followed me into something. I can protect myself in this world. I'm not sure I can protect you." DeShawn moved closer. You don't have to protect me. I made my own choice. Did you? Victoria asked. Or did I manipulate you into thinking you made a choice? I could have said no. DeShawn said. He was close to her now. When you came to my house with that job offer, I could have said no. You had a daughter with holes in her shoes, and I still would have said no. DeShawn said, if something about this didn't feel right, I'm not naive enough to think poverty doesn't make you vulnerable. But I'm not powerless either. Victoria turned away. I'm afraid I'm going to corrupt you, or worse, that I already have. I'm not corrupted because I'm working a better job, DeShawn said. I'm not corrupted because I'm trying to change how a company operates. I'm corrupted when I become like them, when I forget why any of this matters. How are you not angry? Victoria asked. At the world, at the system that let people like you live with nothing. While people like me inherited empires, I'm angry every single day, DeShawn said. I'm angry that my daughter wore shoes with holes. I'm angry that I didn't apply to that engineering program because I was terrified of what would happen to her if I wasn't around every single moment. I'm angry that people like me have to be twice as competent to get half as far. But I'm not going to spend my life being only angry. I'm going to spend it trying to change things. Victoria looked at him. If we keep going down this path, there's going to be serious resistance. The board will eventually fragment. The company might lose significant revenue. Are you asking me to leave? DeShawn asked. I'm asking if you understand what you're choosing. DeShawn stepped back. I understand completely. And I'm still choosing this. I'm still choosing you. I'm still choosing to try. Victoria didn't kiss him. They both knew that crossing that line would complicate everything they were building. Instead, she put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and held it there for a moment that felt like a beginning. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday. Richard Ashford, though no longer officially a member, had been consulting quietly with his remaining allies. There was talk of a vote to remove Victoria from the CEO position on grounds of increasingly erratic decision-making. The night before Richard called DeShawn, I'm giving you a chance to get out, Richard said pleasantly. Victoria's going to lose this vote. She's going to lose credibility. The board is going to want a scapegoat, someone to blame for the failed strategy, and that someone is going to be you. DeShawn listened but didn't respond. You're a smart man, Richard continued. At least you seem that way. So I'm sure you understand that loyalty to Victoria isn't going to protect you. If she goes down, the better play is to distance yourself now. Maybe even provide testimony about her emotional decision-making. Her conflict of interest with her affection for DeShawn hung up. He called Victoria immediately and told her what Richard had said. Victoria was unsurprised. He's trying to create division. He's trying to make you doubt whether helping me is worth the risk. Is it? DeShawn asked. Ask Zara, Victoria said. Ask the 2017 families in Riverside. Ask yourself if you're doing this because it's easy or because it's right. It's hard and it's right, DeShawn said. That's not the same as it being wise. No, Victoria agreed. But sometimes wisdom requires accepting risk. Sometimes integrity requires being willing to lose. The board meeting began at 9 a.m. The conference room was full. Cameras waited outside. Someone had leaked that there might be a major announcement. Richard's allies presented their case. Victoria had become emotionally compromised. Her partnership with DeShawn represented a conflict of interest. The modified development proposals were losing the company credibility. With major investors, Victoria stood and said, everything they're saying is true. I am emotionally invested in doing better. I am partnered with someone I trust completely. And yes, we are losing some investors who valued profit over ethics, but we're gaining something more important. We're regaining a purpose. We're building companies instead of just making profit. And I would rather lose everything than go back to who we were. The vote came down to the board chairman, David Chen, Victoria's husband's oldest friend. He looked at Richard's allies. He looked at Victoria. He looked at DeShawn, standing beside her, with the quiet certainty of someone who'd already accepted both victory and failure. "I'm going to tell you something my friend Thomas told me," David said, the week before he died. He said Victoria was the stronger of the two of them, but that she'd spent her whole life trying to be the person he wanted her to be, instead of the person she actually was. He said when he was gone, I should help her become herself. He looked at Victoria. "I think this is you becoming yourself. So I'm voting to keep you as CEO, and I'm voting to support the new development philosophy." The board split 6-5 in Victoria's favor. She kept her position, with the board secured, but still fragile. Victoria and DeShawn spent the next 3 weeks compiling every piece of evidence against Richard. They found emails showing his financial interests in the shell company that would profit from displacement. They found communications showing he'd pressured consultants to hide negative impact data. They found documentation of his personal benefit calculations, how much money he stood to make if families were displaced at specific prices. One evening, working through files at midnight, Victoria found an email from her late husband to Richard, dated just 1 month before he died. "I know what you're doing. I know about the shell company. I know about the profit projections. And I'm telling you it stops. When I'm gone, Victoria will figure this out. And when she does, she'll be stronger than you ever imagined. Don't underestimate her." Victoria read the email 3 times, then she cried, not quiet tears, actual breakdown, shoulders shaking, breath ragged, all the careful control finally failing. Because her husband had known, he'd trusted her to become strong enough to do what he couldn't finish. DeShawn sat beside her and let her feel it. He didn't try to comfort her or minimize the weight. He just sat with her, in the grief and the rage and the guilt of having almost been complicit. At 3 a.m., Victoria said, "I almost destroyed everything he believed in, but you didn't." DeShawn said, "You stopped yourself, you asked for help, you chose differently." "Because of you," Victoria said. "Because of you," DeShawn corrected. "I just helped you see that you already knew what the right choice was." The second presentation was different from the first. This time, Victoria wasn't asking the board to choose. She was telling them they'd chosen wrong and providing evidence of what that choice had cost. She walked them through Richard's hidden financial interests. She showed the profit calculations that assumed displacement. She presented the settlement offers he'd proposed to families, offers so low they represented theft. She showed the buried community impact studies. And then she turned to Richard's handwriting, his calculation of how many families needed to be displaced before he exceeded his profit threshold. His notation, 87% displacement equals maximum profit. 60% equals sustainable but acceptable. Richard sat motionless. Victoria said, "My husband told me that this company was built to do good things, not just profitable things. Richard Ashford has been systematically dismantling what Thomas built, and I've been too afraid to stop him." She looked at the board directly. "But I'm not afraid anymore." The vote was unanimous. The Riverside project would proceed. With the alternative proposal, mixed income development, preserved community, sustainable profit. Richard Ashford was formally asked to resign. When he refused, the board moved to force his removal. By end of day, he'd retained a lawyer and announced he would challenge the decision. But the company had moved on. DeShawn's promotion to VP of Community Development happened with minimal fanfare. It was announced at a board meeting and noted in a press release. What wasn't announced was that he now had authority over all development decisions at Ashford Capital. What wasn't documented was that he and Victoria were effectively running the company as partners. The Riverside project consumed his life for the next 4 months. He worked 16-hour days, meeting with community leaders, developing relocation assistance programs, creating job placement services. He worked with architects to ensure the new development actually integrated with the existing community instead of replacing it. Victoria worked alongside him. They'd arrive at 7 a.m. and leave at 11 p.m., collapsing into his apartment because it was closer to Riverside than her penthouse. Zara would be asleep when they arrived. Victoria would check on her, a habit she developed without acknowledging what it meant. Stepping into the role of someone who cared about the child, by month 4, they'd relocated 340 families to new housing within the neighborhood. They'd placed 127 residents in jobs. With Ashford Capital, they'd created a community development fund specifically for small business support. The board that had fought them was beginning to understand. Sustainable development was more profitable long-term than exploitative development. One night reviewing community satisfaction surveys, Victoria asked DeShawn, "Why do you care this much? It's not your company. You could take the title, the salary, and leave the actual work to others." DeShawn looked up from the reports. "Because this is my community. This is who we're supposed to be." Victoria understood then that she'd been thinking about profit margins, while DeShawn had been thinking about people. The difference wasn't a weakness in Victoria, it was a capacity in DeShawn that she'd almost lost entirely. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I want you to know that I'm not trying to fix my guilt through you. That's not what this is." "I know," DeShawn said. "This is you actually becoming who you were supposed to be, and me refusing to pretend that matters less than profit." By month 6, the consequences were clear. Ashford Capital's profit margins had dropped 23% from the previous year. Major investors were nervous. Some had started discussing exits. Victoria called an emergency board meeting. She announced that she was considering resignation, that maybe new leadership could restore shareholder confidence and return the company to its more profitable state. The board was silent. David Chen asked, "What's really happening here, Victoria?" Victoria took a breath. "I'm terrified. The numbers are bad. Our profit margins are down. And I'm asking myself if I'm being noble or just naive, if I'm protecting my legacy or destroying it." DeShawn, sitting at the back of the conference room, stood. "If you resign, you're a coward," he said, his voice clear, unapologetic. "You think running away is integrity? It's not. Integrity is staying, it's fighting, it's understanding that the easy choice is always to leave." The board watched the exchange. DeShawn continued, "I returned your wallet in the rain when I had $47 in my bank account and a heater that didn't work. I didn't do it because I'm noble. I did it because my daughter was watching." Victoria, you've got an entire community watching. You've got employees watching. You've got families in Riverside watching. You think leaving is the brave choice. Victoria set down her resignation letter without signing it. Instead, she invited the entire board to Riverside. She walked them through the community. She had residents tell their stories. She showed them the families who'd kept their homes. She showed them the new businesses opening. She showed them the long-term stability that sustainable development creates. By the end of the tour, the board had shifted, not uniformly. There were still skeptics, but the narrative had changed. From Victoria is destroying value to Victoria is rebuilding value. By month 8, DeShawn and Victoria had settled into a rhythm. That wasn't quite professional and wasn't quite personal. They worked together, lived together, mostly, and maintained a careful distance. That fooled no one but themselves. They met for late dinners in the office. They touched hands across conference tables, longer than was necessary. They looked at each other with the weight of something unspoken, pressing down on both of them. One night, Victoria's car broke down on the highway. Deliberately, she would later admit to herself. She called a tow truck and had it taken to a mechanic. Then she took a cab to DeShawn's neighborhood. She walked to his apartment, and knocked. Zara answered. Now 9 years old, she'd been watching this dance unfold for 8 months. She took one look at Victoria and said, "Are you lost?" "Maybe," Victoria admitted. "Dad's in the kitchen," Zara said, "and then he cries when he thinks I'm asleep. He sounds different, scared and hopeful at the same time." Victoria's heart stopped. DeShawn emerged, mortified. "Zara." "I'm telling her the truth," Zara said. "You need to say things out loud, instead of just feeling them." DeShawn asked Victoria if she wanted water. They sat in the small living room, Victoria on the couch, DeShawn in the armchair, Zara on the floor watching them, like she was observing a particularly important science experiment. "I'm broken," Victoria said finally. "I've been broken for so long I thought it was just my personality. I thought being controlled and distant and afraid was just who I was. But it wasn't. It was what I became, because I was terrified of being hurt again." Again, DeShawn asked. "My husband," Victoria said. "I loved him completely. And then he died. And I learned that loving someone meant having something to lose. So I stopped loving anything. I just worked. I just built. I just made money and called it purpose." She looked at DeShawn. "And then you returned my wallet." "I didn't save you," DeShawn said. "You saved yourself. You showed me how Victoria said. By choosing integrity when everything told you to choose yourself. By staying when Richard told you to leave. By believing we could be better." She paused. "If I let myself love you, I have to accept that I wasted years. I have to forgive myself for almost becoming something I hate." DeShawn moved closer. "That's not what love does. Love doesn't make you live in regret. Love just shows you there's more to come." He kissed her then, and Zara made exaggerated gagging sounds, but didn't leave the room. When they broke apart, Victoria said, "I'm terrified." Of what DeShawn asked. That this is temporary, that when things get hard, I'll go back to being the person I was. DeShawn took her hand. "Then we'll both choose differently, every single day, until it stops being a choice and becomes just who we are." 1 year had passed since the night Victoria's wallet slipped into the rain. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change that happened gradually, then suddenly, and then became so normal you couldn't imagine it any other way. The Riverside development was 60% complete. The construction had slowed intentionally, designed to avoid disrupting the existing community any more than necessary. New buildings rose beside old buildings. New businesses opened in spaces vacated by developers. Who'd left when profit margins narrowed? Families who'd almost lost their homes walked streets that were still their streets. 1,847 families remained in Riverside. That was the real metric of success. Not profit, but preservation. DeShawn had been promoted to Chief Community Development Officer. His salary had increased to $220,000. It was more money than he had ever imagined earning in his life. He'd moved Zara into an apartment in a better neighborhood and put her in a better school. She was thriving, straight A's, focused on engineering, like the book had predicted, growing into herself. Victoria had restructured the board entirely. 4 new members brought perspectives, focused on sustainability instead of just extraction. Profit margins were stable, at a sustainable level. Major investors had realized that long-term value was worth more than short-term return, and Victoria and DeShawn had married. The ceremony was small. Just family and close friends. Zara had been flower girl and cried happy tears the entire time. She'd given a speech about how her father had always told her that good things happened when you were brave. And now she understood he'd been telling her something true. They bought a house together in Riverside, a renovation project that was underway, a symbol of their commitment to the community they'd saved, They painted walls and argued about kitchen tile, and somehow became a family, in a way that felt like coming home, after being lost for years. On a cool morning in October, exactly 1 year after the night in the parking lot, they stood at the Riverside Community Center, a building that had been built with mixed profits from sustainable development, that housed businesses and meeting spaces, and a library that was open to everyone. There was a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The mayor was there. News cameras recorded the moment, but what mattered was the community. 400 people, many of whom had almost lost their homes, standing together to celebrate what they'd preserved. Victoria and DeShawn stood with Zara between them, each holding one of her hands. As the ribbon was cut and the crowd cheered, Victoria leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for returning my wallet." DeShawn smiled. "Thank you for recognizing what I could become." Zara rolled her eyes with 9-year-old wisdom. "You two are gross, but I like it." As they walked through the center, through the spaces that families had preserved, through the businesses that had survived, through the community that had endured, the weight of it all became clear. This wasn't about a wallet. This wasn't about money. This was about two people who'd chosen integrity when everything told them to choose otherwise. This was about a child who'd watched her father stand firm and learned that goodness wasn't weakness. This was about a city choosing to be better. The camera pulled back, showing the three of them walking through the community center, through the light streaming from the windows, through the proof that things could be different if you were willing to fight for it. The final words came, neutral and steady. Sometimes a wallet dropped in rain becomes a mirror. Sometimes the bravest choice is seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. DeShawn Hayes chose honesty when he had nothing. Victoria Ashford chose integrity when she had everything to lose. Together, they built something that lasted longer than any contract ever could. They built proof that business can have a conscience, that power can be redirected toward healing, and that sometimes the greatest return on investment isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lives changed, communities rebuilt, and the courage to become who you were always meant to be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that change is possible, when people choose to fight for it, subscribe to our channel. We share stories about grace, second chances, and the quiet courage it takes to love well, because the world needs more people willing to be brave.